From busted Batmobiles to giant lightning machines, the wilderness is full of incredible inventions that have been left to rust in peace. So today, we're going to head into the wild and find them, as we check out the most unusual abandoned technology and vehicles in the world. If you go scuba diving off the coast to Charleston, South Carolina, you'll find what looks like the remains of an underwater civilization, with a great public transport network. See, around 30 miles offshore, the seabed is home to 50 decaying subway cars from New York that are covered in seaweed and swarming with fish. It looks like the lost city metro of Atlantis, but the carriages were deliberately sunk 100 feet underwater in 2002, when the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources decided to create an artificial coral reef on the ocean floor. The area's flat seabed has barely any rocks or natural coral, so there isn't much food for fish to eat due to a lack of rock-dwelling crustaceans and mollusks. And the fish also have nowhere to hide from their predators. So, the so-called Comanche Reef was created to become a new home for wildlife and attract more fish to the area. They removed each carriage's windows and doors, and, when the cars were sunk, they were soon colonized by mussels, shrimp, and hungry fish to eat them. Artificial reefs like this can contain around 400 times more food for fish than a flat seabed. And today, the abandoned subway cars are absolutely teeming with life. Meh, that's still half as busy as the subway I have to take every morning. On the outskirts of Chevilly, France, there's a rusty, unassuming hangar that became home to an old hovercraft from the 1970s. This hunk of metal is the Aerotrain I-80, a futuristic vehicle that was developed by the French engineer Jean Bertin. Bertin built several prototypes with different aesthetics, but they all functioned like giant hovercrafts that floated on an air cushion, a couple of inches above a specially built monorail track that ran through the train's body. As the train moved, it pumped air against the top and sides of the rail, which caused enough downforce to lift it up and enough sideways pressure to secure itself to the track. Regular trains are slowed down by the friction between the wheels and the rails, and commonly used models often top out at around 100 miles per hour. But the floating Aerotrain didn't have to worry about this friction, so it could fly above its track at 267 miles per hour. The I-80 was the final prototype, and it was ready in 1974. But Bertin had competition from another high-speed train system called TGV that was being developed by France's National Railway Company, SNCF. TGV trains ran on specialized high-speed tracks that could carry them at around 200 miles per hour. But they didn't float, so they could also use existing slower tracks where building new ones would be too expensive. This made it far more cost-effective than the Aerotrain, and in 1974, the French government cancelled Bertin's project and funded TGV instead. TGV is still used today, while most of the Aerotrains have been left to rust in warehouses, where they've been targeted by vandals and arsonists. However, this prototype 02 Aerotrain was rescued and displayed in a small museum in Versailles, and some of the monorails are still visible in the French countryside, so remnants of the abandoned project live on, and who knows, maybe someday the Aerotrain will fly again. Some abandoned inventions are so mysterious that it's impossible to tell what they are. Like this gigantic contraption left in a forest near Moscow, Russia. It looks like a spaceship that crash-landed on Earth, or the weirdest water slide in the world. But in reality, the device is a Marx generator that sits inside the High Voltage Research Center, a science facility that was abandoned after the fall of the Soviet Union. This machine is designed to charge itself up with massive amounts of electricity before using it to produce bolts of artificial lightning. Soviet scientists built it in the 1970s to test how well power lines and aircraft would stand up to lightning strikes. But the generator was extremely expensive to operate, so when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly formed Russian government couldn't afford to keep the facility running. This meant that the research center was abandoned and left to gather dust. But its Marx generator is still the largest in the world, and in 2014 the Russian government briefly turned it back on for a demonstration to prove that it still works. Man, I guess lightning can strike the same place more than once. I hate to break it to you, but size does matter, and this next vehicle is as big as abandoned cars get. See, the American Dream is the longest stretched limo in the world, with a 100-foot-long body that holds a hot tub, a helipad, and even a hinge in the middle to go around corners. It was built in 1986 by J. Orberg, a car designer who famously developed the DeLorean from Back to the Future. He hoped Hollywood studios would rent the limo and use it in their movies, But it was incredibly expensive to maintain and honestly, a nightmare to park, so nobody wanted to hire it. In the late 90s, Jay gave up on his dream and abandoned the limo outside a warehouse in New Jersey. He thought the abandoned vehicle would just sit there and rot away forever, but he did put it on eBay in case anyone else wanted it. Around 20 years later in 2014, a man called Mike Manning bought it for an undisclosed sum to restore it. But he discovered that he couldn't afford the extensive work the car needed. So in 2019, he sold it to Michael Deezer, the owner of a huge vehicle collection that's kept at the Orlando Auto Museum in Florida. Deezer had the funds to fix the limo, and 3 years and $250,000 later, the dream was alive again. The car has been fully restored to full working condition, and today, you can see the world's longest limo for yourself at the Orlando Auto Museum. Out in the Salar de Uyuni salt flat in Bolivia, lies a cemetery with over 100 bodies decaying under the sun. But it isn't a graveyard for people. The train cemetery is an area of the salt desert near the city of Uyuni that contains over 100 abandoned train cars that have sat there since the 1940s. See, Uyuni was founded in 1890, and several railways were built to connect it with Bolivia's other major cities. This allowed Uyuni to become a railway junction that linked the cities together, and it soon became an important transport hub in Bolivia's mining industry, as trains carrying tin often passed through it on the way to their final destination. Uyuni wanted to establish an even bigger rail network in the early 20th century, so they imported lots of new trains from Britain. However, the mining industry went downhill in the second half of the 1940s, so the trains were no longer needed. And the demoralized citizens of Uyuni dumped them in the desert, where they've rusted ever since. Normally, the lack of humidity and dry desert air would stop metal from rusting so badly. But the Salar de Uyuni is actually the world's largest salt flat, which means it's the remnants of a saltwater lake that evaporated 40,000 years ago. All the salt was left behind, so whenever the wind blows, it covers the train cemetery, which eats away at the metal and speeds up the rusting process. Man, somebody needs to put those poor locomotive corpses in coffins. Puerto Rico is a beautiful island paradise, but if you venture out into the tropical forests around the city of Arecibo, you'll find one giant blemish lying amongst the trees. This concrete dish isn't King Kong's dinner plate, and it's actually all that remains of an incredibly high-tech space telescope at the abandoned Arecibo Observatory. The U.S. National Science Foundation built the observatory in 1963, and they used it to examine asteroids, stars, and planets for over 50 years. It was the largest telescope of its kind on Earth, but in 2017, it was damaged by the Category 5 Hurricane Maria. The NSF made repairs and continued to work at the observatory, but the hurricane had weakened it. And in August 2020, a cable holding up the telescope's central platform unexpectedly snapped and knocked a hole in the dish. The NSF then spent months trying to repair it, but on December 1st, disaster struck, when the remaining cables broke and sent the entire platform crashing to the ground. The damage was so catastrophic that the foundation couldn't repair the observatory, meaning the telescope had transmitted for the last time. They've considered building an educational center on the site, but for now, the rubble of this record-breaking observatory is still just lying there, and I think it's pretty ambitious of Google Maps to list the site as temporarily closed. Sorry Google, but I don't think we can buff this out. When you travel on a cruise ship, you expect to receive a relaxing tour around some of the world's most beautiful locations. However, in April 2000, the passengers aboard the MS World Discoverer were treated to a pretty stressful experience that ended with them fleeing a shipwreck. See, as the Discoverer attempted to sail through the Sandfly Passage in the Solomon Islands, it hit an uncharted coral reef which caused the ship to slowly topple over. The captain sent out a distress signal, and a nearby ferry evacuated the passengers. But he knew the ship was going down, so he intentionally beached it in Roderick Bay to make the salvage operation easier. Unfortunately, salvage companies were unable to get there because the Solomon Islands was embroiled in a civil war, so the ship lay abandoned until 2004, when its owner Society Expeditions went bankrupt. Since then, nobody has technically owned the abandoned ship, so it hasn't been recovered. But incredibly, the shipwreck has become a tourist attraction, and holiday bungalows have been built right next door, allowing you to stay a stone's throw from the Discoverer. As picturesque as this wreck is, some people are concerned that as the ship continues to degrade, its engine will start to leak oil into Roderick Bay. Back in 2015, a cruise ship called the Ocean Dream was docked in Laem Chabang, Thailand, when it sprung a leak and tilted onto its side. The Shanghai East Time Ship Management Company didn't want to pay to salvage their boat,